All right, good evening to everybody out there. Thank you for joining us for this is our second education session on the topic of wolf reintroduction and management that's being hosted by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. My name is Eric Odell and I'm a species conservation program manager with Parks and Wildlife. So as you likely know, the Colorado voters passed Proposition 114 in November of 2020. And what this proposition does is it requires our Parks and Wildlife Commission to take the steps necessary to begin the reintroductions of gray wolves by the end of 2023. And so we've assembled a series of webinars to provide a foundation of knowledge and information for both our Parks and Wildlife commissioners who have been tasked with this responsibility, as well as the general public. And we're really glad that you're able to join us tonight. Our first session was last month and featured Doctors Diane Boyd and John Horn, and they described wolf management in Montana and some wolf prey interaction studies that John had been involved with in Idaho. That webinar has been recorded just like this one is, and it is available on Colorado Parks and Wildlife's YouTube channel. So if you did not catch that, you can go back and get that again. So I'm the host for tonight's session, and I'm really extremely pleased to have both Ed Bangs and Mike Jimenez join me. And in a minute, each of these invited speakers will share some of their experiences and thoughts and stories of the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone in central Idaho in the mid 1990s, of which both of these guys were fundamental in that effort. It was always our intent to begin this series of sessions with a discussion on reintroduction, but scheduling challenges did not permit that to happen. In fact, every time I emailed Ed, I always got a photo of him in his fishing boat with some other big fish. So we're really glad, really fortunate to have him here today. So really glad to have that. So before we jump into the presentations, a few housekeeping tips. We are recording this webinar, and it, just like the first session, will be posted on CPW's YouTube channel in the next day or two. Each presenter is going to have about 40 minutes to give their presentation. And considering that we've had over 400 people register for this webinar, there's just no way to easily handle all of the questions that we may get from the public. So there's an email address on the bottom of this slide that you see here, Wolf Comments, WOLFCOMMENTS @state.co.us, and you can send emails to that. It's also, that email address is also available on our Wolf Stay Informed page. And we'll use the questions that we receive at that email address to update our FAQ, frequently asked questions on that website. We will be taking some questions from the members of the Parks and Wildlife Commission at the conclusion of the second presentation. We'll go through both Mike's Ed's and Mike's presentations, and then we'll jump into the questions for both of the speakers. And so with that, I would like to introduce, it's a great honor to introduce Ed Bangs. So Ed Bangs was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Gray Wolf Recovery Coordinator for the Northwestern United States from 1988 until his retirement in June of 2011. He received a BS degree in game management from Utah State University in 1974 and a master's degree from the University of Nevada, Reno in 1979. From 1975 until 1988, he worked on the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. His projects included wolf, lynx, brown and black bear, wolverine, marten, coyote, moose, bald eagle, and trumpeter swan management and research, reintroduction of caribou, and land use planning. He was involved in the management of wolves in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming from 1988 to 2011, and he led the interagency program to plan, conduct public outreach, and ultimately reintroduce wolves to Yellowstone National Park in central Idaho in the mid-1990s. Ed often traveled internationally to learn about human and wildlife relationships, and he's published over 100 scientific and popular articles on a wide variety of wildlife management issues. He's given hundreds of professional and public presentations and media interviews, and his professional interests focused on human values in conflict resolution in wildlife management. His personal interests include his two daughters, fitness, archery, hunting, fishing, scuba, wildlands, food, wine, dancing, travel, and the arts. He's found a really good way to enjoy his retirement. Ed, thank you very much for making the time to be with us tonight. And if you want to turn your camera on and start to share your screen, that would be great.
Great, can you hear me okay, Eric?
Yes, that's good, Ed.
Today I'm going to talk about wolf recovery in the Northern Rocky Mountains. That's Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And that occurred over roughly 20 years, involved a lot of cooperators. As you know, wolves were one of the most common species in the Northern Hemisphere, only second to humans. And so they're a very adaptable animal. They disappeared because we deliberately got rid of them, but they have been brought back to the Northern Rockies and the Midwest and a small population in the Southwest. So in summary, wolf restoration is a pathetic series of poorly planned, near random acts, and my life is a tragedy of emotional desperation. I'm going to talk about this issue in three ways. First, I'm going to talk about the facts, basically the science. Then I'm going to talk about the procedure, which is the bureaucracy, the rules, the regulations, the laws that are all involved in this kind of wildlife management. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the politics of the issue, which to me is the most interesting. So I'm a huge believer that science is a good way to get information that's more reliable than burning a witch or throwing a virgin in a volcano. And so we spent a lot of time and money to develop the best science we could to answer the questions the public and professionals may have about wolves. And remember, when we were doing this, we kind of started at ground zero. In Colorado, you'll have 30 years of pretty detailed, in-depth, high-quality research to help your program. So the wolf, the most unusual thing about it is there are a lot of myths about wolves on both sides. And so everybody's got a really strong opinion about what they heard or Googled or whatever. But we relied more on data and information to give us better information. If science isn't perfect, and scientists certainly aren't, but I think it's a better way to go than just kind of make stuff up. So we've radio collared probably over 3,000 wolves by now, and you put a radio collar on a wolf, turn it loose, follow around, and you figure out how wolves live their lives. So the thing you need to remember about wolf populations is they're about packs. Packs of wolves are extended family groups. They defend a territory between 200 and 500 square miles. They produce pups. That's where dispersers come from. They keep other wolves out of their territory. They're pretty visible and relatively easy to find if you have a pack. Lone wolves are very interesting. They can disperse long distances, both males and females. And they go anywhere, can travel like 30, 40 miles a day. So don't let them distract you. It's pretty interesting, but what you really need to stay focused on is packs that have defined territories in certain areas and to be pretty predictable. On the flip side, loners will go everywhere through any kind of habitat, where packs can only live in certain types of habitat. So genetics in the Northern Rocky Mountains is very diverse and secure because of the way we did the reintroduction and the fact there's routine dispersal between us and Canada. Colorado probably doesn't have enough dispersal to establish a population on its own that would be considered genetically healthy, but that's something you can look at through science and get better data information on. So we also looked at a lot of things like where wolf packs would live. And what we found out was it's mountainous forested habitat with a lot of big game animals and not a lot of livestock year round. And so wolves tend to live in areas of mountains, public land, forest. And in the Northern Rockies, those areas are central Idaho, northwestern Montana, and the greater Yellowstone area. These are unique, contiguous, extensive areas of public land that aren't found elsewhere. And so Colorado can learn some stuff from us, but one-to-one comparisons may not be the same because I doubt you have a Yellowstone National Park. So this map is pretty old, but the pattern shows cattle and calves, each blue dot is 10,000 of them. You can see where wolf recovery was in the Northern Rockies, where it was in the Southwest and it was in the Midwest. Lower levels of livestock than the Midwest. And you can see that having wolves in a place like this is probably not going to work out that well. So since the beginning of the program, first pack denned in 87, I believe, wolf packs primarily only persist in mountainous forested habitat. They really aren't, even though they're going out in the prairies and they used to live there in the old days, they're not going to live there today because it's been so modified by human activity. So wolf populations, wolves came back on their own to northwest Montana, and the population barely perked along. We did the reintroductions, and then very predictable, the population grew very rapidly, over 20% per year. And what happens with any kind of reintroduction is when they get in good habitat, it goes very quickly. Then once wolf packs fill in the available territory and there's no empty spaces left for new packs, the population kind of flatlines. And that has happened on the Kenai Peninsula where I worked on wolves, and they returned. It happened in northwest Montana and Idaho and Yellowstone, and that's what will happen in Colorado. Rapid growth and then a plateau as a suitable habitat is filled. So why was wolf restoration possible? People's attitudes about wolves changed. Wolves are an incredibly hardy, resilient species of animal. They're one of the good generalists. They can live about anywhere. There were large tracts of public and private land available in the Northern Rockies. Wild ungulates their prey was common. Livestock were only seasonally vulnerable to wolf predation. And then if you did have conflicts, they can be managed just like you manage conflicts with black bears or mountain lions or deer, elk, or raccoons or anything else. And so those things together allowed wolves to return to the Northern Rockies. So everything has costs and benefits, and wolves are no exception to that. The two big issues with wolves are livestock issues. It says inevitably their affair ended. Howard worried excessively about what the pack would think, and Agnes simply ate the flowers. A lot of people hoped this would be the extent of wolf livestock relationships. Other people were convinced it'd be more like this. Well, I'm addicted. Have you tried Carol's sheep dip? One of the things that wolves do, and their whole lifestyle is structured around killing large ungulates. And that includes livestock at times. It's actually less than you would think it would be, but it does happen. Now, to the industry, the livestock industry, wolf damage is insignificant. But a few ranches can have chronic losses, and some can have substantial losses depending on the year. And it's pretty easy to downplay wolf predation if it's not your livestock are being killed. But it's a very big issue, and it's something you need to really pay attention to. And also the fear of damage is very real. In the Northern Rockies, I had several ranchers tell me they can't even sleep at night. They're afraid they're going to go round up their cattle in the fall in a remote area, and there won't be any calves left. And so science, we can tell them that's not going to happen, but the fear of that is a very real thing, and that can be addressed by competent management of problems. So when we first had wolves back and we had a problem, we relocated wolves because every wolf was pretty valuable because there were so few of them. But as the population grew, we ended up killing problem wolves. And I think over 20 years, we've probably killed 10% of the population a year to reduce the depredation of wolves on domestic livestock. We also tried to look into every possible non-lethal tool out there, and we had everything you can possibly think of, we tried. We kept a pretty open mind about it, but the fact was there's no silver bullet to this. Some things work sometimes in some areas for a little while, but nothing is really going to fix the problem of wolves occasionally attacking livestock and you needing to remove those wolves because they're very good at their job. And if you let it do it over and over, they get better at it. And you don't want that to happen. There's also a compensation program. The federal government gives the states money to help with the economic impact of wolf depredation. That does take some of the sting out of wolf depredation, but many ranchers told me, I don't raise my cattle to feed wolves or mountain lions or bears. I raise it to feed people. And in the worst case scenario, this is very remote, rugged areas in Idaho, for every 7 calves killed by wolves, only 1 was actually confirmed. And so compensation is not a cure-all either. It helps, but other management programs also have to go in concert with compensation. We studied the relationship between wolves and their native prey for 3 decades now. The impacts vary widely with each situation. But the bottom line is that in some situations, mountain lions, bears, and wolves can compete with hunters for available surplus. One thing to keep in mind, especially if you start looking at possibly having wolves in Colorado, is that wolf packs must be numerous and contiguous territories. They have to be in a big clump together where there's no empty space in between them to have much of an impact on prey populations or the overall environment. So people that are expecting maybe large-scale ecological restoration or large-scale impacts to big game populations, I'm not sure Colorado has a type of habitat that will allow a lot of wolf packs to live in a fairly small area and saturate it. Now, the blueberry of happiness, long absent from his life, Ed, is visited by the chicken of depression. I became a biologist because I want to be jumping out of helicopters on grizzly bears and tagging stuff and living the wildlife outdoors. In reality, you also spend a lot of time with the bureaucracy, writing rules, looking at laws, dealing with budgets and all that kind of stuff. And Colorado is going to do that because that's a critical component of wildlife management. So the state will need regulations of how they're going to manage wolves, what the penalties will be for killing one, who can kill one or not, can you harass them, how will livestock depredations be handled, if they're impacting big game populations, how will that be handled? And that's a lot of public involvement, a lot of active, involved debate. And I'm assuming that Colorado already does that for other resident wildlife like mountain lions, black bears, and deer and elk and everything else. And they'll probably use that same process, but that is going to be up to you guys, but that's something you're going to have to do. So now I'm going to talk just a second about your employees that are going to do the work on the ground. We're kind of in an age now where truth means you're going to end up being roadkill. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on your employees to do certain things. And so, for instance, this calf was reported maybe killed by wolves, not really sure, but maybe. So there you are, that's actually me when I had hair, trying to figure out what killed that calf. And you can do necropsies in the field, and if you have a carcass and stuff, be pretty sure of what killed it. But imagine the pressure on the employee. If this is a wolf kill, there'll be wolf control in the area, and that calf, dead calf, will be worth $1,000 to that rancher. Likewise, if you have wolves in an area and you're going to end up removing them, there are some people that are going to want to know, was that really justified, or are you cooking the books? And so you need to set up a system that has checks and balances, and the roles and responsibilities of who looks at what when and who makes the call need to be crystal clear, and you need to treat your employees pretty decently because they're just people. You can make a mistake. You can have a wolf kill and not catch it. You can have a dead carcass or a dead animal and think it's a wolf kill when it's not. So people make mistakes, but through training and expertise and experience, you get better and better at it. But you really need the public on both sides of the issue to trust that you're giving it a fair shot. The worst thing in the world is to call something a wolf kill when it's not, and then try and get wolves in the area when there aren't any. Then you've kind of botched the whole system. Also, letting wolves continue to prey on a person's livestock is certainly not fair to them or the rest of the wolves that don't depredate. So the history of wolf stuff's pretty clean. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which used to be the Biological Survey, was hired to kill them all in the Western United States. We did that because people didn't want them around. Wolf planning started in the 60s, talking about putting wolves in Yellowstone National Park. And so for 2 decades, there was a lot of research and studies and conversation about what it would be like to have wolves back in national parks. And a lot of these early discussions were all about Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is 3,500 square miles of paradise, especially for wolves. But, it's also surrounded by reality. And so we knew wolves would leave the park pretty quickly, and they would start interacting with a living landscape where people make a living, recreate, they raise livestock, they hunt, they fish, they mine, they timber, they run four-wheelers, they ski, they do all kinds of stuff. And so if you look at Yellowstone, it's a great place for wolves, but that may not be the best way to look at wolves that may return to Colorado. So in the 1980s, there was still a lot of politicking going on, and it looks like wolves were actually coming. In '87, we actually had a pack show up. And the next year they depredated. That resulted on the ground effort, and then Congress started getting more and more involved with wolf stuff. studies and that such a thing. And then Congress told us to prepare an environmental impact statement. We got 200,000 comments on it. The largest public comment on a federal rule to date, so very big politics involved. Litigation started in '94, but in January we started wolf reintroduction. The plan was for the feds to start reintroduction, do the reintroduction of wolves, and then hand all the management over to state fish and game agencies. That did not work because the state legislatures got involved and they stopped all the fish and game cooperation with wolf work, and it ended up being just the federal government and the tribes that managed wolves for the next pretty much 20 years. So we looked at which wolves do we get. Basically, a wolf is a wolf is a wolf. So we had some coming anyway. So they were the closest population. We wanted wolves that lived in a similar place, that hunted similar prey. And so we got them nearby wolves that lived in the mountains and hunted elk and deer and moose. And then those are the ones that we put in central Idaho and Yellowstone. In Yellowstone Park, we tried to get family groups. But a time or two, we just got another adult, a male breeder wasn't available, and put him in the pen, and they dated, got married, and they had pups the next spring. In Idaho, we just got young adult wolves, half of them female, just dumped them out on the ground and let them do their thing. This is how most reintroductions occur. Remember, wildlife reintroductions are dime a dozen. You can't hardly think of an animal that hasn't been reintroduced. So doing it with wolves is novel only because people get pretty excited about it. So we bought wolves from fur trappers in Alberta, and we darted some packs from helicopters in '95. And Alaska Fish and Game really helped us out with that, and we appreciate their expertise in wolf capture and finding wolves to do that. And we repeated the program in British Columbia in '96. So in Canada, we had just dog kennels set up, and we staged the wolves in those places, gave them roadkill, fed them, ice blocks and water. And we also had veterinarians look at them to do health checks, screening. We did vaccinations, parasite control, all the normal stuff you do with any wildlife reintroduction. This is not any big deal, really. I mean, things are reintroduced all the time. So then we shipped them to the States, and in Yellowstone, we kept wolves in about 1 acre pens for 3 months, each family groups, packs in each pen, and then turned them loose in March. And then in Idaho, in January, we simply transported the wolves to Idaho, took them to the southern end of the wilderness areas and turned them all loose, and they ran all over the place. But it ended up forming about 18 pairs. It was amazing at how good they are at finding a good place to live and to mate. And so both methods work pretty good. The soft release is the pen thing. Wolves certainly roam less, and we were able to keep most of the packs in Yellowstone Park initially, but it's much more expensive. Logistics to feed wolves and security and materials is difficult, and it's pretty time consuming. The hard release of animals, which is the way most reintroductions are done, duplicates natural processes. The wolves roam all over the place, but it's relatively cheap and fast compared to pens and all that kind of stuff. We had a goal of having 2 breeding pairs for 2 consecutive years. That's when we would stop reintroduction. You need to know when you're going to start and when you're going to stop. We reached that goal within 2 years, even though we thought it would take 3 to 5. And we worked really good, really fast right away. And we plan to release wolves in the fall because so they'd have time to meet before the February breeding season, but litigation delayed that. So you can expect some rough spots in the road just due to human conflict and litigation and those kind of things. So the management of wolves, the conflict with wolves, depended on the number of breeding pairs and breeding packs. The more packs resulted in more liberal management. I'm sure you'll hear more about that later. The other thing about wolves, which is really helpful, is they don't need land use restrictions. We basically had none. They do just fine. They just need for people not to kill them. So we didn't, there's no restrictions on timber harvest or mining or anything else. Wolves don't need that, which is a big plus because a lot of people are more afraid of big government than they are of wolves. So despite having 1.5 million comments over our plans and rules and having 1,000 meetings with hundreds of groups and having both sides involved for 20 years, we were litigated pretty constantly for 15 years because we either protected wolves too much or people thought we didn't protect them enough. And so because of that human element, you'll need to have not only a plan, a B plan, but probably a C and a D to think about what happens if, all of a sudden somebody was going to give you wolves, won't give them to you, or which happened with us in BC, or if there's litigation and you want to release them in the fall and you had to wait till winter. So have plans on how to deal with that stuff. So wolves can't be everywhere. So how do people decide that? And the answer is politics. So not everyone benefits from wolves, and certainly livestock producers have legitimate concerns about having wolves running around the landscape, just like they do too many elk eating forage or having mountain lions and black bears around. And so you need to think about how you're going to deal with that. And the purpose of agriculture is to not have nature run wild. And so you should understand that livestock producers have legitimate concerns, and that a program that's fairly addresses their concerns. Hunters are the other big constituency that's concerned about wolves. So hunters are kind of all over the board on this thing. Some hunters are, we don't like wolves. The only place an elk should be is in my freezer. Other hunters are like, God, hearing those wolves howl was the best experience of my life. Most hunters are probably like me. I hunt so I can see mountain lion tracks and hear a wolf howl, and in Alaska running with grizzly bears, and that's part of my hunting experience. But I also want there to be enough surplus elk and deer and moose and caribou left that I have a good shot at getting one. And so I think that's the way you manage mountain lions and black bears, and wolves shouldn't be any different for that. So a lot of people are just fearful of government. So nobody wants somebody else telling them what to do. And so a lot of the stuff over wolves isn't wolves as much as it is the feeling that somebody else is making me do something I really don't want to do. And so fear of government is also a reason that people are pretty nervous about a big program that's got a lot of controversy. So the public's going to be very passionate about this. They always have been. Imagine your ass eaten by a wolf, shoot the wolves, and then the biologists. Those two comments were made by people that did not support wolf recovery. The last two comments, what brain dead so-and-so thought this up, may your putrid corpse rot in hell, were people that really supported wolves and didn't like the idea of us killing 10% of the wolf population a year because we wanted to keep depredations on livestock at low levels. So wolves and wolf management has almost nothing to do with reality. They're an incredible animal. They're easy to manage. They're generalists. They're the simplest part of the whole deal, and reintroduction is not a big deal, except for the people part of it. So the wolves attract people's attention, both pro and con. Everybody likes to hear about wolves, whether you love them or hate them. And this really distorts reality about the true nature of wolves. And this publicity invites some people to spread fear and anger. And they do it deliberately, getting people all riled up, because people that are really upset and angry generally make really poor decisions, or they're more likely to. So, as we all know, that wolves tend to seek out weak prey, the sick, the weak, the stupid, and the unlucky, the old and the very young. But they also attract people that want attention, money, votes, and publicity. So wolf programs, be aware that there will be people peddling all kinds of stuff. They will have the only solution. They will know the only truth. And so you have to have a program that's balanced, fair, and isn't subject to fraud, waste, and abuse. Because in the end, you're going to need both sides to kind of trust that everybody's getting a fair shot. So real problems have to be addressed, just like they do for mountain lions or black bears or deer or elk or raccoons or skunks or anything else. So try, if you can avoid it, to not get distracted by all the drama around wolves, because there's going to be a lot of it. You have to create a desired future condition. In the Northern Rocky Mountains, that was a recovered wolf population that was managed by the professional state fish and game agency, and that would include public harvest. That was our goal, and that's where we went. And I think to date, it's worked out pretty well despite a hiccup this past winter, but we'll see how that works out. So also, you've got your science, you've got your rules and regulations, and you've got your politics. To the extent that you can, although it's very difficult, try to keep each part of this as pure as you can. If you have politicians deciding what the facts really are when they aren't, they can establish rules that are impossible to implement. And that makes your people on the ground look like a bunch of incompetents, because they've given a task that isn't based on reality. So be honest and try to be nice to each other. It's more difficult than you would think. So the conflict is really between human values. Wolves are just wildlife. They're not that big a deal. They're not as bad as many people feared, but they're certainly not as good as many hoped. Wolf populations will be controlled. Where you have packs will be controlled by people. And the real issue is how is that going to occur, not if it's going to occur. So the public debate is going to remain emotional and all that stuff just because of human nature. That as people, that's what we do on highly symbolic issues. We get pretty excited about it. So what does the future hold? Luposlipophobia, the fear of being pursued by timber wolves around a kitchen table wearing socks on a newly waxed floor. It's going to be pretty wild for a while, and it helps to have a little bit of sense of humor about it. But it also helps to try and do the right thing and be honest and be fair to all the people involved. And that isn't an easy task, but I think professional fish and game agency like Colorado Parks and Wildlife has the potential to do that because they do it with a lot of other species. So I guess I'll answer questions when Mike gets done with his presentation. Thank you.
You're muted.
Thank you, Ed. Somehow we lost Eric and all of that, so I'm filling in for him. So for everybody watching, I'm Reed DeWalt, Assistant Director of Aquatic Terrestrial and Natural Resources. Ed, thanks for your comments and presentation. We'll come back to you with some questions after Mike presents, but I'd like to introduce Mike Jimenez. Mike has been a wolf biologist for 30 years. Most of that time he worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. He was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service project leader for Wyoming for 12 years. He was the Northern Recovery Area coordinator for 6 years after Ed retired in 2011. He was also the project leader for the Idaho Reintroduction in 1995 and 1996 with the Nez Perce tribe. When wolves were delisted in 2008, he was the wolf project leader for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. However, wolves were soon federally relisted after a court order. He left the Wyoming Game and Fish and went back to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service until he retired in 2016. Mike went to graduate school at the University of Montana, where he obtained his master's in wildlife biology, and his thesis was pre-selection of recolonizing wolf packs in British Columbia. So Mike, I hope I did that justice, and thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. We're working.
You are. Looks good, Mike.
Great. Well, I'm going to kind of take off on where Ed left and add and probably repeat a few things. I'll focus mostly on Wyoming and some of Idaho. One of the things, as Ed mentioned, we learned very quickly. So this is not, let's see. Where slides are not clicking.
Okay. Why don't you wait one moment, and Kirk's gonna we'll stop. I'm gonna stop your share. Kirk's gonna bring it up on his screen. All right. One moment. Okay.
Go ahead, Mike.
Perfect. So I'll just say next slide. So what we learned very quickly, as Ed mentioned, is some people really do not like wolves, no matter what. They see them in very negative light. They see them as killers. There is nothing positive about that. And that probably is not going to change, didn't change for us. And my guess would be it's not going to change for Colorado. Go ahead. Next. So the other side really likes wolves, and they see wolves as a symbol of nature, of what's good about nature, of wilderness. Go ahead. And so wolves take on this image of being these, soft, cuddly animals versus next, this animal that people detest. And that is the arena on which wolves were recovered. And everything we did was viewed by people that either like wolves or really dislike wolves. It'll be the same in Colorado, but that is the starting point. Go ahead. So we knew, and as Ed mentioned, there's been a lot of science and a lot of research done on wolves. And wolves, like any other predator, predation is a very critical component of a healthy ecosystem. And wolves prey on what's available and what's vulnerable. Okay. So one of the issues that was brought up is that they prey on available ungulates, and people also hunt available ungulates. So that immediately starts one of the first conflicts. Wolves hunt, they test things. They go out, they test things, they chase things, and they look for what's vulnerable. And it's either physically vulnerable or vulnerable, next, vulnerable like in deep snow or some type of location. And they're very successful at testing and finding prey that's vulnerable. Next, and they're capable of taking down large ungulates, next, with as a pack. There's a very coordinated effort and they're very successful at it. Next. So while all this was going on, you have to remember the goal of the Endangered Species Act is to prevent extinctions. The ESA is not designed to be a long-term management plan. And when recovery occurs, when you secure those species so that there's no threat of extinction now or in the foreseeable future, that was always the background goal of ours. But we, again, had to function under the ESA. And again, that is not designed to be a long-term management strategy. Next. So in Montana, as Ed brought up, there were some 60 wolves already coming and naturally recolonizing Montana. And it was mainly due to control efforts in the southern part of Canada were declining. And wolves are very good at locating and exploring and finding vacant habitat that has a prey base that will sustain packs. And they're very good at dispersing, finding those areas and recolonizing those areas. So as control efforts stopped in British Columbia, these packs were formed. And so at the time of the reintroduction, there were some 60 wolves in Northwest Montana. When we reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone and central Idaho, the goal was to use central Idaho and Yellowstone Park, not just to reintroduce wolves, but that would be a release site for which where wolves would expand and disperse outwards. Next. So just to stop for a second here to give you an idea what wolves are about and that wolves' capability. Wolves don't disperse this young, but wolves are innate dispersers. They're very good at finding and leaving the area where they were born or packs that they came from. These two pups are probably a couple months old. A friend of mine was out checking bear traps next, and they walking along about a mile away from a den. You can already see personalities forming. One's facing the truck down next. And finally, he takes off. But this is the type of animal. This is, as I say, wolves don't disperse this young, but wolves are tenacious, very resilient animals, and they're very capable of reestablishing themselves. Next. So back to this. Wolves were reintroduced. Again, the goal was to disperse and allow wolves to recolonize the Northern Rockies. Okay. Next. So that happened very quickly. Within a couple of years, wolves left Yellowstone and came into Wyoming and south of Yellowstone, east of Yellowstone. By 2002, each of these black dots is a pack. You can start to see packs forming all around Yellowstone Park. And it's not from packs necessarily leaving the park, it's from wolves dispersing. By the time wolves are 3 years old, most wolves leave the pack they were born in, and they disperse and they go out and look for a mate and establish a new territory and a new pack. So this is in 2003. Next. By 2010, each of these shapes here is a pack in Wyoming, and you can see wolves have definitely moved out. There were over there were over 34 packs, 19 breeding pairs, a couple hundred wolves in Wyoming, and wolves were starting to definitely recolonizing east of the park as well as south of the park. And we talk about carrying capacity, and you'll hear that term used a lot. And I would offer that there's a biological carrying capacity, and that's looking at what the ecosystem will support. That they'll support a number of wolves by a prey base or enough habitat that wolves can set up territory. They're very territorial and they defend those territories. So there's enough habitat and enough prey. There's also a social carrying capacity, and I would offer that that's human tolerance or acceptance of wolves. And as you see, wolves are starting to fill in these areas and expand, and not necessarily just in remote areas, but areas where there's a lot of livestock and not necessarily the best place where wolves can be. Next. So by 2013, you can see these are packs forming. This happened very quickly, and you see that there's well-established wolves outside in Wyoming, in Idaho, as well as Western Montana. And you can see this growing and expanding. And again, no surprise, and it shows the wolf's ability to disperse and recolonize available habitat. Next. So again, this is 2014. Wolves are continuing to expand. They're reestablished. They're even moving into adjacent states, into Washington and Oregon. And you see wolf numbers are growing very substantially. Next. So as Ed had mentioned, we did not see wolves survive once you got out. This is a topo map of once you got outside of the forested areas, wolves went out there, but they really didn't survive the survival rate was very low. So we looked at about 300 wolves that were radio collared, and we looked to see where they were going. And this went on from 1991 to 2008. Next. So what this is a slide of dispersals. The yellow dot is where it started, and the red dot is where it ended, and the arrow is a vector showing the direction. And we looked at this, and again, it's a little bit shy of 300 wolves, and wolves took off in all directions. Next. And we learned, the average dispersal was about 65 miles, but they went up as far as 550 miles. We had a wolf go from Cody, Wyoming to the north rim of the Grand Canyon. The average dispersal age was about 32 months. Both males and females disperse. Females reproduce more often than males. And we learned that dispersal occurred year round, but it peaked right around the breeding season in January and February. Next. Kind of counterintuitive. We thought maybe because of the topography of the Northern Rockies running north and south, you might see more of a pattern, but actually wolves disperse pretty much in 360 degrees and really no significant difference. And they went in all directions. Next. And try next. So what this map shows is kind of what a wolf, and it's probably very typical. This is a GPS collar that took daily locations. A graduate student had it up here, and the pack was near Bozeman. And this is where the wolf traveled. If you looked at a start and an end point, the straight line distance would have been about 400 miles, similar to that map with all the other dispersals. If you look at what actually happened on the ground, the movements were around 3,000 miles, and this is in less than 6 months. It's a young female wolf. And it went around, it went in and out of other packs east of Yellowstone. It went through Wyoming, it interacted, it tried to go across I-80, it couldn't do it, went back around, tried to get at 80 again, couldn't do it, went over into Idaho, went over into Utah, crossed over I-80, went down into Colorado, came back up into Wyoming, crossed I-80 again, crossed I-80 again, came back down, and finally ended up, and it died here, but it made it into Colorado. This is probably pretty typical of long dispersals. They explore, they test new areas, and they put a lot of miles on. It's not simply just a start and an end point. Next. Next one. So the reality, as it won't take long, back one. Yeah, it won't take long. In Colorado, I don't think will be very different. The scale may be different, but wolves are going to disperse out of the areas where they're first put in or where they first established. And in the Northern Rockies, wolves came back fairly quickly. Next one. So next. So when they're back, as it's been said, those historic conflicts still exist. And the two big ones are big game and conflicts with livestock. And having successful wolf recovery means you need to take, you need to be responsible for depredations. And just like wild ungulates, wolves get near domestic livestock and they do the same thing. They chase, they test those animals, they look for vulnerabilities. And even if they don't prey on the animals, imagine livestock, they chase animals in and out of pastures, break through fences, out of grazing allotments. That in itself is a huge problem. And it's not necessarily good or bad wolves, like good wolves don't kill livestock and bad wolves do. It's much more where you were born or where you're lucky enough to be. If a wolf is born in a fairly remote area and there's not a livestock, life is good. They kill wild ungulates and that's their life. When they live in areas where there's high livestock, they look at livestock as a potential prey, and that can become a problem. The good news is that most wolves did not kill livestock. Some wolves killed some livestock, but some wolves killed a lot of livestock. Next. Next slide. So they in sheep, wolves in areas with sheep. We lost a lot of sheep. Some young horses were killed. Next. Dogs. This is a Anatolian shepherd, a guard dog guarding sheep, was killed. Next. And next slide. And hunting dogs. And anytime, one second, go back for a second. Anytime hunting dogs, young horses, things like that are killed, it becomes, and understandably, especially your animal is eaten, you know, that becomes incredibly emotional. And we've had a lot of people who even supported wolves go through some experience like this, and there's no way they want to have wolves around. That's going to happen. Okay, next slide. So what usually happens, next slide. What usually happens is wolves follow prey, and prey, elk, deer, just like humans, look for areas to winter that are a little milder. They look at they move down to lower elevations where there's less snow cover. Wolves follow those animals. Next. So wolves, what that does, it brings wolves in proximity to domestic animals. Wolves will travel near domestic animals. Some wolves will just pass through. Other animals will test those animals. Some will check them out, and some will view them as prey. Next. We also had in Wyoming, and I don't know if you have them in Colorado, we had feed grounds. So near Jackson, Wyoming, there was a national elk refuge with 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 elk being fed. These particular are state-run feed grounds. There's 22 of them in western Wyoming, where there's 500, sometimes up to 1,000 elk being fed all winter. Wolves, recolonizing wolves. Imagine being a recolonizing or dispersing wolves, and you bump into this. It's like, yes. And wolves have established near or within those feed grounds. That became a huge issue and a controversial one, to say the least. Next. So part of the problem, this is that same feed ground in the summertime. So wolves key into those areas where there's high elk densities, high natural prey. A lot of times those elk leave those areas in the summer, and cattle come onto those either on public grazing or on private land. And wolves now have denned in the springtime and are in proximity to cattle. That becomes a problem. And I guarantee you that will become a problem wherever wolves are going to show up. Next. So as wolves started reestablishing themselves, the gray is the number of wolf packs. This is Wyoming. The gray with the number of wolf packs each year, and the yellow is the number of packs that depredated more than once in a given year. And as the wolf packs expanded into more areas, we saw depredations increase, and pretty soon we started seeing almost every pack, 2004, 2005, were taking part in chronic depredations. And it concerned us, to say the least. And we were trying all kinds of different things to stop it. Next. So we could we could either use better guard animals. Next. Better guard animals. Next. Tougher livestock. Go ahead. Next. But in reality, next. In reality, what we started really looking at was looking at how were we controlling them. In the beginning, when we were going through reintroduction and recovery, we really used a lot of either harassment. We looked at trying to move wolves if they were in dens close to cattle, aversive conditioning, rubber bullets, soft barriers, riders, herders, guard animals, hard barriers, fencing, flattery, all those type of things. As Ed mentioned, it worked in some places. Sometimes it was not just this universal fix. So as the wolf as recovery went on and we got wolves in more places, we learned that some of those places were really not suitable for wolves, and we started using lethal control more. Next. And so we also relocated. There was 117 wolves relocated prior to 2002, the recovery goals. It's a plus and a minus. It's very expensive. It had mixed results. A lot of times wolves got back into trouble again, but sometimes it worked. It might be something to consider, but it's not, again, it's not a simple fix. Next. So that chart that I was showing, this is the number of wolf packs, the number of wolf packs causing trouble. As time went on, wolves showed up in more places using lethal control. And again, it's not randomly just killing wolves, but very surgically going after wolves and looking at wolves that were in places that were just chronic problems year after year after year. We focused in encouraging packs in the places that were more remote and less dense livestock. And we saw the number of packs that didn't cause trouble actually go up, and the number of packs that did cause problems go down. And it was simply because of us focusing and lethally removing wolves that were chronically causing problems. Next. So if you look at this, this is the population growth of Wyoming, and this steadily increased over the years. If you look at livestock using that approach, it absolutely dropped, and we kept livestock depredations relatively low. Sheep depredations did the same thing. It doesn't take, when you lose sheep, a lot of times there are big numbers involved, and a couple problems can actually bring the numbers up very quickly. But the trajectory was that the management solved that problem. And again, the whole idea is that it's not randomly just killing wolves, but it's removing wolves that are chronic problems in areas that are chronic problem areas, and encouraging wolves and the population to grow in those areas where there's not quite so much dense livestock. Next. So ironically, the red is the Wyoming population over time. The white is Yellowstone Park. And Yellowstone Park was a very stable wolf population, but it plateaued right around 100 wolves, and it stayed there pretty much over the years. And that's probably a density dependency based on the prey the prey available and availability and the habitat and room for wolves and territories. The Wyoming population continued to grow. And again, even using lethal control, that population was not deterred by that and continued to grow. Next. So it was mentioned about lawsuits, and just to bring this, the details aren't so much, but we tried to reclassify or delist wolves 2003, 2008, 2009, 2012, and courts reversed those each time. And I'm sure Colorado is going to go through the same experience. And the point here is that the management flipped back and forth between state and federal. And so what became important was then when states defined or developed a management plan, is that states and the feds worked together so that when this did happen, there was a transition and a continuity, that feds were handing off a program that was similar to what states were going to do. And if it did flip back, or I should say when it flipped back because of court actions, the feds would take that back up, and it would still be under the authority of the ESA, but it would be similar to what was going on with state management. Next. So one of the things was mentioned that public hunting is part of the goal and bringing hunters into wolf management as well. What really changed for Wyoming was when state management we finally delisted and state management allowed for public hunting. That diffused a lot of the anti-wolf sentiment. And also the state developed a compensation program that not only compensated. We having troubles? The state developed a management plan that not only compensated for dead livestock, but it also worked up a formula based on how many dead livestock that they would also pay for missing livestock. And that pretty much diffused a lot of the arguments and the negativity towards livestock management, or at least for the compensation end of that. And that helped considerably. Next. So one of the thoughts, just one last thought about native wolves. There's been a lot of disagreements and different ideas about how many subspecies and what wolves came from where. And at one time there was as many as 27 different subspecies. Now there's about 5 that people agree on. But the idea that these lines are somehow fixed and this is a different wolf than this, than this, than this, you have to just look. Next slide. Look at the dispersal slide that we came up with. And if you see these animals moving these long distances, you realize these animals cross these lines that humans drew to show where subspecies were all the time, and their dispersal capabilities make those lines, they have some meaning, but they're not fixed lines, and they're more of a gray, thick transitional area, if you will, so that wolves coming from the southern part of BC are really no different than wolves naturally recolonizing Montana or being reintroduced. And the idea of native wolves, it's a little bit of a red herring. If you don't like wolves, you probably won't buy that. But the reality is that these wolves really travel long distances, and those lines, the meaning, the lines are not quite as strict as they appear. Next. So we spent a lot of time collaring wolves. These are wolves that we collared. Next. And the main way that we located them was traditional in a fixed wing small plane. And we would locate them. We'd fly down low to get visuals on them, to do pup counts, to see how they're doing, how many, do counts. And there's pros and cons to it. It can be very expensive. It's very difficult doing it in mountainous terrain. Frequencies bounce. The frequencies we had actually were more difficult than the ones we had used in the past. So they bounce. It takes a lot of time, a lot of cost to do that. You may want to consider, or if you've already considered, using GPS collars when you reintroduce wolves. That solves that problem, but it creates another problem that you know where the wolf is all the time. You create an insatiable appetite in the public that they want to know where wolves are, and somehow it's important to know every day where a wolf is, where did this, what he did. And it's interesting on a research basis, but it's not at all necessary for management. And that's probably a deterrent for GPS collars, and you'll have to figure out and balance out the pros and cons and which works the best for you folks. Next. So the rider, this is to remind me to say that anything you plan on, especially in reintroductions with wolves, can and probably will not turn out quite the way you want it. And it's very important, as was mentioned earlier, to have a contingency plan, not A, not B, but all the way down the road to what happens if things don't go quite right. And to give an example, when wolves showed up, came into Missoula, Montana, and half of the load would go to Yellowstone. There would be all kinds of fanfare, publicity. There'd be decoy trucks, all kinds of, law enforcement, everybody riding these trucks down to Yellowstone Park. And it was a lot of publicity. When they went to central Idaho, everybody left, and there would just be, there we were all by ourselves. The congressional, the federal, the Senate and the congressionals opposed wolf reintroduction and would not allow state agency to be involved and not allow the Forest Service to be involved. So as the Nez Perce tribe, we were, had to rent a rider truck to move wolves, which we hadn't planned on. Next. And we had to make cages so that we actually ended up with 5 more wolves than because they had extra wolves coming down. We had to create cages overnight, and these wolves came down. We put them, the weather went bad. We had to, instead of coming in, we were going to put them in, bring them in on a helicopter. We had to tow them, each one of these cages behind on a sled on ski behind a snowmobile to get them right up to the wilderness areas where we released them. So the point of it all is that be prepared for things that will go wrong, have contingency plans. It's all very doable, but things will not go as smoothly as thought, but they are manageable. So to kind of conclude, reintroducing wolves in the Northern Rockies will be similar in some ways, different because of the size of the Northern Rockies compared to Colorado, but wolves will do well. The distribution and the population size, it'll be conflict driven, and it really will depend on how you deal with conflicts. If you can come up with sound management plans, mitigate those problems, it will allow wolves to be in more places. And I would suggest that it isn't so much of the right or the wrong decisions, it's more of an if-then relationship. If you do something, there will be short-term consequences of that and long-term, and it's really important to sort that out. What may seem like a good short-term fix, and people might be happy short-term, may be setting a bad precedent, may set some really difficult things down the road. So be aware of that. And for example, if you have wolves killing livestock, you want to ask yourself, what are the short-term consequences? Whatever you do, one side's going to be happy, the other side's not. That may not be the long-term consequence you want to have for the implementation of your management. So you want to ask, really, is it going to help wolf recovery? Is it going to help wolves be in more places? There's some reasonable logic and science behind it? And in the end, you're not going to win. It's not a popularity contest. It's really just kind of keeping your eye on the ball and trying to make sure that your management is consistent and people tolerate wolves in as many places as possible. So the final advice I would offer is really try to be consistent. You'll develop credibility with consistent management decisions. Let science guide you. Be honest when things go right or if things go wrong. Let people, deal with them, address those things. And if things go well, spread the credit out to others. If things go wrong, take the blame and fix it and correct it so that it works better. And if you do all those things, you'll come to the same conclusion next, that you still have people that really don't like wolves, no matter what, 30 years later, next. And you'll still have people that really, really like wolves. And that's not going to change. And what you're going to find is both sides are going to be very vocal at certain times. One side's more vocal than the other, but those things are not going to change. But it doesn't mean that you can't have wolves on the ground and be very successful at it. So next, I think from there, we're good for questions.
Well, thank you, Mike, and Ed, you as well. Lots of sage advice there and lots of years of experience, and certainly appreciate both of you gentlemen joining us tonight and sharing both of those with us. This is probably the favorite part of the meetings that we've had, is to do a little question and answer with you guys. I've had several questions come in from commissioners, and I'd like to ask those questions now. And either one of you that feels like you want to tackle that question, please have at it. Or if you both want to do that, please feel free to do that as well. And we'll just continue this for as long as we have questions and kind of have a little dialogue here. And apologies, we lost Eric. I don't know, his Zoom crashed for some reason and we can't get him back. So you guys are stuck with me. So if you don't mind, I'll ask the first question tonight. Came in from a commissioner just now. It says, given the level that wolves disperse and the seasonal migratory nature of most ungulate herds on Colorado's western slope, how important is the initial reintroduction site? And I have a follow-up question to that after you answer it.
And you want to go, Mike?
So I think you'll probably have to decide if you're gonna look at, are you gonna soft release them, like Ed described what was done in Yellowstone Park, where you have pens or some kind of holding facility, or whether you're gonna hard release them, let them go in some, and they're gonna take off. You're gonna have to decide that and decide which one works. They both have distinct advantages and disadvantages. I'll start with a hard release. In central Idaho, they were released in wintertime where there's deep snow, there's a prey base that stays in there, and it's a natural time for young wolves to be dispersing. So everything kind of fit, but it's a huge, the Frank Church Wilderness area is the biggest wilderness in the lower 48. So that was to our advantage, and that hard release worked very well that way. And they did disperse, but it was controlled naturally by those conditions. In Yellowstone Park, the pens worked, and they were family units, but it required access to those pens. It required a lot of people involved, far more expensive, and a big Yellowstone Park is a big ecosystem. When you release those animals, there's a prey base in there that kept them relatively in those areas. So yes, it will be important how to pick those sites, the size of the area, the number of wolves, whether they're going to be family units, whether you're going to mimic dispersal, all those kind of things. But the sites will be very important. And you don't want to have wolves right into livestock right off the bat. The advantage of Yellowstone Park and Idaho's release sites is that it took years for those animals to really disperse out so that you're starting to deal with serious conflicts.
Now, I might add a couple thoughts on that. If you do a hard release, you don't have to be nearly as concerned about the site as you do. I actually had a couple of ranchers were like, hey, if you want to release those wolves on my place, that's fine, because they won't be there within an hour, which is true. And so you need to release them that when they travel, they tend to go back where they came from, that they'll go to an area that they have a better chance of finding a place without as much livestock and wild prey. But the hard release, they'll move so much that it's not nearly as critical as the soft release.
Thank you for that answer. And just the follow-up I had mentioned, and you might have touched on this a little bit before, but what criteria should we prioritize for reintroduction sites? Is there a certain set of criteria that we should prioritize?
I guess I'd go with just big blocks of public land that have wild game and forests. I think if you do a hard release, they'll figure out where the best places are, and some will pick really crummy places, but you'll have some that pick the best spots. Trying to micromanage lone wolves too much, I think, is going to be a disappointment. But what do you think, Mike?
I agree. And what the advantage of reintroduction was is you brought numbers into the whole process. Is that you may, and I wouldn't be at all surprised, you're going to release some of maybe a lot of them aren't going to last, and it'll be doing it over and over again and repetitive, and that should probably be designed into the whole program so there's no surprise. These things are going to move, there's no question, and some of them will pick spots that are going to work, and some are going to show up and cause problems, and you'll be confronted with that right away.
Well, thanks for the answer to that. I have another one. This one's a little bit longer and it's a two-parter, but I'll read both questions and then let you guys chew on it for a minute and then answer. So can you offer advice on how to keep science in front of this process in order to gain the confidence of all sides and possibly mitigate the social and emotional discussions? And the second part to that, is this the correct approach to prevent opposing sides from feeling disenfranchised?
Well, I would definitely try to lead with science, and science is not going to answer every question. And Ed had a good slide where there are going to be a lot of things, it's the art and science, and you put the two together, and there's going to be some people management, there will be some politics, there will be some, but the science, there's tons of it. And so there's plenty to draw on. It's well respected, and not even but, and you're still going to have to involve or bring in, how do you deal with people? And that's going to require people to develop good people skills, to communicate, to be transparent, to build credibility. That credibility is what people are going to trust. And even if you're not science minded, if you trust the people that are doing it, they'll look towards trusting science more than if you just try to have, you know, abracadabra, just believe the science. It's gonna take some work.
Ed, do you want to try that one too, or you good with Mike's answer?
We're in an era, and I've been seeing this trend I've been in wildlife stuff for 50 years now. More and more expertise and experience and all that kind of stuff isn't valued as much. That's just a sign of the times. It happens in healthcare, it happens in wildlife management, it happens a lot of things. People have strong opinions and just, you know, this way. There's a joke going around that it's like, what do people dislike most about Christianity? It's Christians. And it's like, what do people most dislike about science? It's scientists. And so the best thing you can do is just give it a big try and be honest and not confuse data with opinions, because that happens among scientists quite a bit, is they try and give their opinion as the data instead of just presenting the data. Just give it your best shot and try to stay with it, but it's going to be very difficult. It's going to be harder than it was. But on the flip side, you now have 30 years of intensive millions of dollars worth of research on wolves in areas very similar to Colorado. So you can make much better guesses than we had to.
I would also add that advocacy can be difficult to deal with. So you can have scientists that are presenting, here's what we found, you know, it's yours to make the decision on how you're going to make management calls. And you can have scientists that are going to be advocates of a particular view. And it's hard, even though they're both science, that can be very confusing for the public. And you can have people pushing one direction versus the other, all in the name of science. And it becomes this game of my scientist is better than your scientist. And you have this arms race of how to get an opinion. Be aware of that and try to, you know, minimize that.
All right. Well, I'm constantly amazed at technology and the questions keep coming in. So are you guys good with answering a few more?
Sure.
So we'll get back to kind of more of the mechanics of how Colorado might do this reintroduction effort. Some more like targeted questions there. So would you recommend that we look at like targeting for wolves that we want to reintroduce? Should we look at young adults of family packs or intact packs? Like what grouping of animals should we look at bringing in?
Well, I guess I think a hard release is much more suitable than a soft release, not knowing that much about Colorado, because you don't have a Yellowstone Park with a maintained road and pins and staff and all that stuff. And if you do that, you just want a bunch of young adults and just turn them loose and they'll figure it out. But you know, you could go the other way and do pins, but then you got to talk about, you got all the neighbors next to where the pins are. You don't, unless you got a really big national park, which I don't think you do. So I made the joke once, which is a little bit tongue in cheek. You know, like two monkeys with a pickup truck and a six-pack could have done wolf reintroduction. Biologically, it's kind of that simple. They really are that adaptable. And so the tough part is going to be, I think you have a lot of leeway on making mistakes on where you drop them and all that kind of stuff. They'll cure that within a day or two. But they can kind of do it on their own, so to speak. I think if you set expectations that you're going to control every aspect of it, you might be setting yourself up for failure. And that ruins public credibility.
If you're going to do a hard release, family units are not going to stick together, and that can be a PR nightmare. And we did that in the early days, relocating wolves, thinking everybody would stay together, and it just becomes this horrible news event every day of the wolves took off, the pup starved, this wolf went over here, that wolf, and the Fish and Wildlife Service was the cause of the destruction of this wolf pack. I agree with what Ed's bringing up, is that if you're going to do a hard release, young animals, and you're just going to have to keep doing it. and wolves will do it on their own. And where the wolves show up and it's an appropriate place, or a place that's going to work, they will do that. You won't be doing that. They will figure out those things. And if they show up in places where there's livestock, you'll have to determine ahead of time how you're going to deal with it. Are you going to relocate them again? Are you going to, you'll have to decide. There's lots of options, but that will happen too.
I think one thing we did that helped us was a wolf in an area is not a problem. A wolf killing livestock in an area is a problem. And so you have to make it clear that, a wolf isn't a problem if it's just walking around. If it's doing something you don't want it to do, then that's something you have to address. And there'll be a ton of pressure to be chasing these wolves everywhere and just, which is just a nightmare because you can't win. And so you got to be careful in some ways of over managing and over predicting what your abilities are going to be and not.
Very good advice. I would blame the wolves. Let the wolves pick their spots, and they will pick appropriate spots. Wolves are very smart.
So kind of along the same line of questioning, can you offer any advice on source populations, such as wolves from like mountainous forest areas that are more similar to Colorado, neighboring states, anything like that, just so that we can ensure the best success for this reintroduction effort? So a little bit of talk about maybe potential source populations, what you guys might recommend.
Well, I guess I try to divide questions into that seems like a science question, and you have a very capable Fish and Game department that can look at all the pluses and minuses and that kind of stuff. But I think since you've got wolves kind of coming in from Wyoming or Montana anyway, that seems like that would be the obvious place to get them from. And my guess is Wyoming would give you all they wanted.
Yeah.
All they wanted.
The caveat to that would be, don't pick wolves that have been around livestock, so that you're not bringing wolves that are used to killing livestock. So look for wolves that I'm sure Wyoming, a lot of the states, Idaho would do the same thing, but look for wolves that have not had problems. There's no history, of conflict with livestock. It's starting, at least that one is fresh, and you're not starting right off the bat with something that's already had problems.
Yeah, do not take problem wolves.
Yeah, do not take problem wolves, even if they're free.
Good advice, and we'll write that one down. So our commissioners keep sending some good questions in here. One I have that just showed up is, how quickly will prey species become habituated to wolves and forced to adapt by changing behaviors? Does that question make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, we heard that a lot is, an elk in the Yellowstone has never seen a wolf before and will stand there and they'll all be killed. That's true for the first couple, but these things evolve together. The reason that an antelope runs fast is because of the honing effect of thousands of years of wolf predation. They know each other. So those elk caught on pretty quick. The first couple didn't, but it didn't take but 3 or 4, and then they knew what wolves were about, and they made that transition pretty quickly. Mike, you want to jump in on that on feed grounds and stuff?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be a real issue. I agree. You look at evolution, and wolves run fast, elk run faster, wolves run fast. There's an arms race, and that's gone on for a long, long time. I've watched them from a plane, an elk running away from a wolf, and it's mind-boggling how fast, and elk are formidable themselves. It's not turning wolves loose and suddenly they're going to kill elk easily, and the elk are too dumb to figure it out. They'll figure it out.
Just some information on they've done a lot of radio calling studies on what moves elk around. Because one of the stories is that when the wolves come in, the elk all leave and go somewhere else. And what the research shows is elk do that with human hunters. When human hunters come in an area, they'll go to a ranch that doesn't allow hunting or something else like that. But they really don't. They may make short movements on wolves, but there's not big movements. And so that tells me a lot of elk know how to handle wolves. You know, they figure it out pretty quickly. And so you don't have to be that concerned about these naive animals just being massacred by wolves. They evolved together and they figure it out pretty quick. And they're already dealing with mountain lions, which are even a better predator than wolves actually, and black bears. So it doesn't take much of a thing to think, you know, hey, that's not a mountain lion, but it acts, you know, it's potentially dangerous. So they'll figure it out. You don't really need to worry about that.
We had wolves on feed grounds in Wyoming, and we collared wolves and elk, and look how they interacted over the years. And the fear was wolves are just going to slaughter wolves for, you know, elk for fun. They're going to kill more elk than they eat. The elk are just, you know, aren't going to figure out wolves, and it's just going to be a disaster. What happened was exactly what we're describing. The elk, you know, did short movements. They'd be back the next day. The wolves didn't kill any different rates of predation than in a normal, in a wild area as compared to a feed ground area. The elk would come back for food, and the wolves would still be there feeding on their buddy, the elk they killed the night before. It's not something that's going to be that big of an issue.
Okay, thank you for that. Obviously, lots of interest around that particular topic with the size of our elk herd and importance of it here in Colorado. Sorry for the delay. I'm looking at these questions coming in and juggling it. But can you speak more about the cost of livestock losses? The question I'll just read it verbatim. Most of the data is about 10 years old. Is there any way of knowing the cost of livestock losses? I'm sorry. So more an estimate of current livestock losses.
I'd ask the Fish and Game departments or the Wildlife Services guys on that. I think they've been pretty consistent. I think livestock losses in Montana went down after they were delisted and the hunting started on wolf packs, because smaller packs tend to prey less on cattle. But I think in Montana it averages like 110 livestock per year or something. It's not really grown that much. In fact, I think it may have went down. But the Fish and Game guys would have actual data on that, and I'd recommend going to people that have actual data on it.
And current data, yeah, our stuff is older than, yeah. So again, different states use different approaches, and again, Wyoming had quite a bit of depredation because they have a lot of livestock, and they came up with a plan where they paid for dead livestock as well as missing livestock based on the number of dead they had. They would pay up to a certain amount for missing, and that helped a lot. And you might talk to Wyoming Game and Fish folks to, you know, get an opinion on how that's worked and how that's going to diffuse things.
And just for the public listening as well, our next session 3, is going to be specifically on damage prevention and control and payments and those type of things. We're going to really drill into that topic during the next session. So we look forward to that. Let me see. I got one more, one's coming in. I'll wait for that one. But, and you guys can answer this in degrees if you want, but the question is, were the Yellowstone and Idaho reintroductions a success from your perspective? And then what metric or outcome support your conclusion? And if you don't want to go there, that's fine too.
It'll depend who you ask, as all our slides show. If you like wolves, it was an unbelievable success. One of the success stories of, you know, modern wildlife management, and it brought back wolves, and here's all the good things. If you don't like wolves, it was a governmental fiasco. You brought back wolves, they're killing livestock, they're killing elk, they're doing all these things, and it's big government overriding states' rights. From a biological perspective, I think just objectively, most people would say it's been a success.
Good answer.
All right. Thank you for that. That other question just came in, and I think it was you, Mike, that you were speaking about GPS collars and monitoring wolves, and that's something it was asked in our last meeting. But how did your monitoring change from your initial releases, where it sounded like you had a lot of collars out, to how monitoring happened when the population got bigger? Any advice on monitoring? And I mean,
Sure.
GPS collars are amazing. So any advice there on monitoring wolves?
So I would draw a distinction between research and management. And if you're going to do a research project and you have specific goals and there's a need for that kind of fine scale data and movement and locations, that's one thing. If you try to manage wolves that way, that has a lot of problems, and you create this expectation in the public that somehow you need to know where this wolf is every day, what it's doing, and it becomes, you put out collars and you get them back in the fall, especially once state managed wolves and you're hunting wolves, you'll get them back and you'll have a box full of radio collars in the fall that you spend all this money, time and money putting on during the year. So there's a balance. There's a lot of value to them. If you have problems, you can go locate wolves that are causing problems, but it also has a downside to it, that it creates a false expectation that if we only knew where these wolves were, we could do something or control this or do this and micromanage wolf movements and all this. Our approach was to have enough wolves that you're looking at wolves as not something special all the time, and you're looking at wolves as wildlife, and they're just like any other member of an ecosystem, and you kind of pull back from that wolves are special. The sooner you can do that, the better it is. It's easier to manage things, but it's a balance. It's not like white collars or collars. More collars, the better it is. That is certainly not our experience.
I agree with Mike. Just one thing to think about is a lot of times you send subliminal messages. And so, you know, GPS collars are fun. They really give a lot of information. They last much longer than they did when we were starting and stuff. But think about, you call somebody up at 10 at night and go, hey, I thought I'd just let you know there's a wolf in your backyard. Everything's okay. The real message, holy shit, your kids aren't outside, are they? You're about to be, you know, your house is going to be burned down. They're going to take over. So you really got to think about how you use this information. And I mean, you could create, like Mike said, just constant panic, like too much information. You know, it's like wolves are so evil, you have to know where they are every single second. And that is certainly not true, but you can create that perception and then you have to deal with that. So you can cause yourself a lot of problems by over promising what you can and can't do.
A quick example of that, in the early days, we gave some ranchers that had chronic problems, we gave them a receiver and we hooked up an omni antenna, straight antenna, and say, here, you can listen, and we put it on a pole so that they could pick up wolves, you know, in the general area. Like, we got calls all the time, 10 o'clock at night. I hear them, they're coming. And it's just wolves walking around. Wolves spend a lot of time exploring their territories, their home ranges. It's not helpful to make that what, you know, that's the perception of what you need to manage wolves.
Very helpful, and appreciate the answers there. I just have one more come in. They're kind of slowing down, so hope you guys are doing okay. But the question that just came in is, in your experiences, is there a noticeable difference in human conflict by season? So for instance, do wolves come in conflict with livestock or humans more in the winter and on winter range, or much more, or is it much more a situationally dependent situation?
Want to handle that one?
Sure. So a couple of things. There's conflicts on private land, and there's conflict. We have a lot of public grazing in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, and I'm assuming Colorado does. So you have big public grazing allotments. When wolves are, when cattle is present on livestock grazing allotments, you have a different kind of problem. They're big open areas. They're not confined. You may even have riders going in and out, but that's far more of a spring, summer, fall kind of issue. And there is a seasonality to it. If you have year round on private, that can be, it's it's a different experience. Wolves will key into those areas, and you can have it year round. Year-round livestock is difficult. That can be problematic.
Just a thought, your next session will deal with that in a lot of detail and actually have people that have the data and all that kind of stuff. But by and large, wolves are opportunists, and that applies to cattle too. So I'm not sure what the exact ratio is, but they mainly kill calves. And a lot of times in September when they're having pups, that's the time that they're most likely to kill livestock, because the wild game is becoming more healthy and harder to get, because elk are at the peak of their condition in late September. And so you may see them trying to feed pups by switching to killing calves and stuff. But there's tons of research and data on all that stuff, and probably experts that have looked at that data and the more recent data would have a little bit better answer for you.
All right. Well, that's about it. I would like to ask a question. Obviously, this is a major undertaking for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Any last advice from two seasoned veterans who've done this for multiple years for a state that's we're kind of new to this, and we want to do it well and do it in a timely manner. But any like one sage piece of advice for us?
Go ahead,
Ed.
I'll go with it. So one strategy is just to hire a lot of beginning biologists and stuff, and just use them like paper towels. Just as soon as something goes wrong, blame them, rip them off, shred them up, throw them in the garbage, and get another one. That's one strategy. But I think a lot of it, you guys deal with all really difficult issues already. Like elk management in Montana is probably worse than wolves or about anything, really. Just because there's so many of them, people complaining about them. But you deal with this stuff. I think if you just stick to your strengths, which is science, highly professional staff that's probably overtrained, that you can handle this stuff pretty easily and keep your credibility. One thing I would suggest, and I'm not sure if it's saved Mike and I or not, it's really hard to stay honest when people are screaming at you and things aren't going well and your boss is asking you what to happen. So if you take care of your employees and give them good information and training and advice, I think the public will respond much better to that than trying to please somebody all the time and then find out that you're not following sound science. Because as I said before, if you set up a program that can't be successful, you'll be unsuccessful, and it'll kind of be your own fault, and then people will lose credibility in you. So I think just do a good job like you do on all the other species, it'll work out.
I would echo that, and being straightforward, being honest, and when things go badly, step up to the plate and say, yeah, we screwed up, or here's the problem, and not try to hide things. That's what will build your credibility, and that's what will make it work. If you try to put spin on it or bring in politics, it'll be a spiral to the bottom, and it's very difficult to get your credibility back if you do that. So I would be straightforward and communicate with people and spend time and let people develop people skills where they can communicate with people, and do that ahead of time. Not the first, you don't meet a rancher the first time when you're looking over a dead calf, that you allow your people to spend time out in the field, you train them well, and you let them learn to communicate with people and ranchers so that there's a personal contact, and environmental groups. It goes to both sides of the equation, because both sides will be unhappy with things you do.
Well, thank you both for that. And Ed, I hope you didn't scare off too many prospective biologists with your humor. Because we're going to need additional help for sure. I know this takes a lot of help. So I just, again, want to say thank you to both of you for helping us out with this. I very much enjoyed the presentation. And I don't know if you can see it, but we carried over 150 people on the web to watch, and it's just truly amazing that we can do this. Last year at this time, we didn't even know how to turn these things on, and here we are hosting a huge webinar. And just very appreciative to you both for your sharing of your experiences and everything you've done. And I hope you will answer our calls when we call in the future, because you have a lot of wisdom to share.
Thank you and good luck.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So
It's our pleasure.
I'm gonna wrap things up here and just thank everybody who tuned in tonight. I hope you found it informative, and I'm sure there were things that probably you didn't know, or maybe surprised you, or maybe even stirred a little passion in you one way or the other. And we just really appreciate the public's involvement and your desire to be part of this, and we continue to want to provide these. I also want to thank CPW staff who pulled this off. There's a lot that goes into this. I'm looking at a screen with over 10 staff that are on this call right now just supporting this. Apologies that we lost Eric, because he's much more entertaining than I am, and we're sorry that you guys couldn't converse with him, but I know that you know him well as well. So again, thank you, Mike and Ed. We really appreciate it. For the public that's listening, we are going to have a third and final presentation on the topic of livestock conflict and wolves, and just a lot of the different aspects around that to be addressed, and hopefully provide some language around that and some tools in the toolbox for everybody who are listening. So mark your calendars. That's going to be Wednesday, June 16th. We're still working on the presenters right now, but I do think you'll find them of high quality and very informative. So the registration to be on the live call at that time will be sent out in a similar manner. So be looking for something on our website or through a press release, and we'll look forward to doing this again on June 16th. From 6 to 8. So again, thank you guys. Thank you to everybody listening. We'll be in touch for more advice, I'm sure. So with that, I'm going to conclude the night and say good night to everybody, and we'll see you next time.